Hey Saints, while I'm digging in here, I went out to dinner with a bunch of friends from church last night, and then dinner, and then a show. And at dinner, the uh, pastor of the church I went to, he's gearing up for a study on Genesis, expositional study in Genesis, and I think he was having fun. He just wanted to stir the pot, so he no more than get there, and he says, what do you think about old Earth or young Earth? And it's one of those, intentional things. He was just joking around. It's like saying, Calvinism and Arminianism, or pre or mid or post trib rapture, is just one of those things you throw out there just to see. And nobody was really answering. He kind of put me on the spot, and so I said, well, it's not the answer you're expecting, but I said, I'm an old earth, young creation or recreation person. And I think everybody in this end of the table, I think, was staring at me like, okay, what the heck is he talking about? I'd say our church is fairly evenly divided because the denomination doesn't take a hard stance in this between young earth creationists and old earth people, not evolution stuff, but old earth in one form or another. And so it's just fun to have that kind of discussion. But, I started explaining a few things. I said, any of these doctrines, you have to study the verses behind both points of view, because otherwise, if you just stick at the doctrine level, all you're going to do is get defensive and angry or whatever. If you understand both points of view and the verses that support it, I said you're much less bound to get argumentative or get upset because you understand the other person's point of view, or at least you understand the doctrine that led to the other person's point of view. And I said that usually just deflates that argumentative feeling, because you know that somewhere along the line that doctrine was built on sound biblical study, right? So you can just take it down a notch. And so, we didn't have his dinner. I threw a few things out. I said, I think the gap theory is valid. I'd say even if it's not, there's definitely, more than a handful of verses that you have to resolve for, regardless. Choose young earth and creationism or choose old earth. You have to resolve for a series of verses, and you can't just say, well, I ignore those or I don't look at them. The way you have to do, biblical exegesis is you have to cover for all of the verses with the best fitting from Scripture argument. That, at least that's my opinion. That's what I read. When I look at the commentaries of stuff, the strongest arguments are people that don't just skip verses they don't want to deal with. They find an answer that resolves for all the verses that speak to something. And so that's where I kind of came down on. So I said, some verses against, let's say, my view, and I brought up specifically in the Ten Commandments, people would use Exodus 20 verse 11 as God's giving the commandment for the Sabbath, for 6 days that you work, and the seventh day is a Sabbath. So the Lord in 6 days created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested. And so if you look at that verse, and we can take a quick look at it here in a bit, you're locked into 6 days for that creation account. And so I said, you have to account for all the verses, and that would be what would appear to be a death blow to the gap theory in some sense. And so that's kind of where I left it. You couldn't do a full Bible study sitting at dinner, but it was fun. And so I wanted to kind of scrape together my thoughts today. And I said I'll send you an email about at least my understanding of the scripture, and what he does with it or ignores it, doesn't matter to me. But I'm sure he'll probably read through it anyways. And at least I like the notion of both the pastor and the people at the table all agree that some of these doctrines are complicated, and maybe some of them are at least beyond us average folk to come to a solid conclusion on, and somewhere in there becomes the faith and the trust in the Lord. But that never prevents me from doing the Bible study. And so I sent an email, and I just wanted to share the summary Bible study here, and hopefully it blesses somebody. Whether you agree with me or not, please don't leave hate comments down below. I've looked at all the points of view, at least, let's say, not every permutation, but I looked at many of them, and this is just where I'm sitting currently. And so I'm sharing the body of the email here in my notes on eSword, just so you can see. Here's my personal take currently. I'm not trying to be all righteous about this. Here's where I'm at with this thing. But I think there's some good stuff in here, so I wanted to share. Well, let me just, I guess, start with the hardest part of this, let's say, and that's the first couple of verses. Well, the first 3 verses for sure. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then it goes on from there. God saw the light, and it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness night, and the evening and the morning was the first day. So here's the days of creation after that, okay? And I'm sure those verses are super familiar with anybody watching this video. So, I'm going to say my current understanding is I hold to the gap theory. And I'll tell you, not because I'm looking for where did the dinosaurs, go in history and blah, I'm not a day age person at all. Cut me some slack. Stay with this video to the end. I think you can take a very good literal view of the Genesis account here. Subscribe to this notion of a gap, but solve for the other verses and all the other scenarios better than other accounts that I've studied. And that's just where I'm currently at. And so what is this gap theory? We'll look at it in depth here, but Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. The gap theory says that God created the heavens and the earth, and it's in this, we find it in this condition, without form, void, darkness was on the face of the deep. And so there's a gap between this and the first day. And people, parse the verses a little bit differently. I'm going to show you kind of why I'm saying something existed, and it was form, voidless, and dark, and the Spirit of God then moved on it, and then things started happening, and you had the first day. Okay, that's kind of the gap. It wasn't, day one wasn't God creating heaven, God creating earth. It became, or is in this condition of without form and void. He created, without form and void, but then the Holy Spirit did something, and he saw it was good, and then God divided light from darkness and called the light day and the night, whatever, and all of that is the first day. No, what we're saying is this is a condition of the earth that's without form and void. And what happened down here, starting with day one, is a recreation of the earth in the picture that God wanted to be in for humankind to come. And so if you haven't ever heard of that sort of gap or potential gap there, that, in a nutshell, is the gap theory. And why do you go searching for it? And why do you try and stick that in there? It's not to try and find a home for the dinosaurs before Adam. It's because there's verses in the Bible that point to that being the scenario, and the earth then becoming into this condition without form and void. I want to start though with the Hebrew, because one of my biggest fans of Bible study is Chuck Missler, the late Chuck Missler. Man, I learned a lot from him, especially early on. He just brings it with so much detail. But his Genesis study, you can go find it on his channel, I'm sure, somebody's channel. He says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, period. Right? Bam, he hits that. And so he creates this linear flow, like first this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then that happened, boom, boom, boom. And yet he also subscribes to the gap theory. And so you can see that there's variations of all of this. When I dug into this, yes, I studied Chuck Missler, I studied, tons of people, right? I'm sure all of you have too. I ran into everybody trying to parse the Hebrew, but the one that I think is really interesting is Dr. Michael Heiser. And so you guys, I'm sure, have seen some of his videos. Let me play just 4 or 5 minutes of him, and then we'll come back and get into an article that then I think spells out this gap theory and tries to defeat the gap theory with some reasoning and all that. So hang on.
So we have independent clauses in verses 1 and 3 and dependent in 2, and the dependent is the result. That's the relationship. So here I have grayed out in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the translation we're used to. But now let's play around a little bit. What if I translated it this way? When God began to create the heavens and the earth, you say, well, that's cheating. You can't do that. Yes, I can. I have a PhD in Hebrew. I can do whatever. No, seriously, if you look in the Jewish Publication Society translation of Genesis 1:1, that's it. When God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now, is that a complete thought or an incomplete thought? That one's certainly incomplete because it's prepping something to follow. You're being prepped as a reader. So when you put the word when in front of it, you know that it's just leading to something. It's not an independent thought or act. It's leading to one that you haven't gotten to yet. Now let's put them side by side, or I'll get there eventually. We have in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Again, that's the traditional translation that most of us are used to. The Hebrew consonants are as follows. Hebrew, of course, was not written with any vowels. I have added a vowel here in red. If I was a Hebrew scribe using the vowel system that was invented at around the 8th century A.D., those are the only vowels we have, those little dots and squiggles that you see on a Hebrew text, the vowel system. If I wanted to be sure that my reader would understand I'm talking about the beginning, in the beginning, I would use that little mark that looks like a capital T. And it would be pronounced Ba-Reshit. That's called in Hebrew the definite article. Just like English definite article, the word for the. Okay? That's all it is. Now, if I wanted to opt for when God began, it would look this way. It'd be 2 dots underneath. And that means there is no definite article. It's just it's a vocal cue that we don't have a definite article here. That would be Beh Reshit. Which one do you think is in your Hebrew Bible? The Hebrew Bible that like everybody uses now, that has come down to us from centuries ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not have vowels. Vowels only start again in the Middle Ages, late antiquity. Which one do you think we get in Hebrew texts that have vowels? The capital T, how many vote for capital T? We've got to vote for capital T. How many vote for the 2 dots? The indefinite one. We've got 4, 2 dots wins, 4-1. No, let me show you. Let me show you which one we have here. I'm going to go to Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. This is the German Bible Society edition. It's Beh Reshit. The translation, when God began to create, is a completely legitimate translation. In fact, it more accurately reflects the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text that we have. Now, you could just as well say, and trust me, some do, well, it didn't have vowels to begin with, so we should put Ba Reshit in there and be definite in the beginning, first creative act. Sure, you can say that. The only problem is you don't have a single manuscript that does have vowels that has that, like 0. And I bring that up because it's something to store away in your mind, because we're fond, as evangelicals, we're fond of saying things like, oh, those Hebrew scribes were so good at what they did. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that 99.9% accuracy in transmission and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, they do. Hebrew scribes didn't lose their brains in the Middle Ages. Okay, they're just as good then as they were at the time of Qumran. So it's cheating to just say, well, I like that other vowel better. And I can have that because it's not original. Yeah, you can. But there is no tradition that supports it. And that's what we have for the Hebrew Bible. We have scribal tradition for the way it's vocalized. So let's go back here. We got 2 possible translations. If we opt for the when translation, now look, I've changed the colors. Now we have dependent clauses. We don't have a series of independent ideas. We have 2 full verses of clauses that are leading up to something. And that something is verse 3, and that is the main idea. That's the independent thought. So here, just think about it. Read along with me or in your mind, and just think about how it sounds. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, now the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. It really has a different feel. It sounds like everything in verses 1 and 2 are just prep. They're not really happening. They're the writer describing what conditions, now catch this, the writer is describing conditions that already exist before God actually creates anything.
So hopefully that was kind of an interesting little insight into those first 3 verses of Genesis. And the reason why I think it's important is, Dr. Michael Heiser isn't the first scholar to point out that the very first statement or first verse in Genesis doesn't stand by itself, I guess you want to say. He's saying they're dependent clauses to the 3rd verse. And we're going to come back to that again in a little bit, but stick that in your brain that it was the condition, according to Dr. Michael Heiser, of when God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, was that it was starting from an existing earth that was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. These are dependent clauses to this. So when God said, "Let there be light," this already existed. And I think that puts a different notion to the way you would flow through here. You wouldn't try and necessarily make these chronological. You would say this description is the condition at the point when God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Okay, so hopefully you get that. Now we're still going to address the gap theory, and I don't know actually if Dr. Michael Heiser accepts or rejects or hasn't commented on the gap theory. I'm not sure. I've watched maybe an hour or two of his Genesis account, and I can't remember whether he picks a side on that or just lets it go. I think he tends to just say, "Here's what you can learn from the Hebrew." I don't think he necessarily takes a hard stand on it, but I could be wrong. So anyways, that's step one, understanding the Hebrew construction of the verses. And now let's turn and take a look at this gap theory, because it's going to make some points, and then the rest of this then I think falls into place a lot more neatly than at the end of the argument. I want to take a look at the blueletterbible.org, so I'm going to a decent source, not an internet blog or something. I'm going to go into this gap theory, and the reason why I think this is a good one, one is coming from a sort of a notable source. The commentary in Blue Letter Bible are sort of vetted commentaries that people generally would accept as insightful anyways, even if you don't agree with it. And this one happens to be on what is the gap theory, and I'll paste this URL down here because I think it'd be useful. If you like this study, you should read the article for yourself and maybe retrace some of these steps. It's a little bit longer, so what I want to do is buzz through here a little bit, just hitting the points and not reading the whole thing to you, and let you come back and read the article, okay? So the first topic he paints, now he's going to say this is the gap theory, and a bunch of people hold to it, and then he's going to come down later and say, I disagree with the gap theory for this, and this reason, which is great. You know, it's actually trying to argue against what I believe, and I think that's healthy. So perfection then chaos, and so gap theory people like me would say God didn't create something that wasn't perfect, as we find it there in Genesis, especially 1 verse 2, that what he did is he created it perfect, but then chaos, then there was a destruction, and the earth became desolate. And just quickly, I don't see, I guess he goes into the judgment. I'll hold that for a second. And then a reconstruction occurs, and that's verse 2. God began a recreation or restitution, involves successive days. The remainder of the chapter, Genesis, deals with the reconstruction of earth, not the original creation. And I would actually say it starts in the third verse, or actually when he starts to talk about and let there be light, which I guess is the third verse. So there's the reconstruction. So consequently, Genesis speaks of creation, judgment, ruin, and recreation. Yeah, generally, I think gap theorists would hold to that. Literal days, but old earth. And people that hold the gap theory want to accept the Bible literally as well as a conclusion of modern science about the ancient age of the earth. They are not evolutionists, correct. The gap theory provides a solution to two problems between Bible and science: the time problem between the fossil and the fossil problem. To reconcile the Bible, science, geological ages are placed between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. I don't hold to that. Granted, maybe there's gap theory people that hold that, but I'm not trying to shove the dinosaurs into the gap or whatever. I'm not trying to solve geological ages. I'm trying to solve for Bible verses. If the mapping of ancient artifacts or whatever fits into this, wonderful. If it still is a challenge, I don't honestly care. I need to solve for what the Bible says and all the verses in the Bible. So I hope you catch that. This isn't a science project here. What was the judgment? The judgment is usually spoken of as a flood because of the statement in Genesis 2, the earth was covered by water. The judgment is also known as a Luciferic flood, named after the angel that became a devil. And I think there is some validity to that, because what do you have in the Garden of Eden description? Satan had already fallen, apparently with his fallen angels, right? So somewhere between, and you see it, in Genesis 2 and 3, where God created Adam and Eve, and then Satan's in the garden all of a sudden, and he's already, the shining one, the serpent that deceives. So it's already fallen by the time you get to, the first verses here in Genesis. So when did the angels fall? And I'd say yes, that could be an interesting thing to put into the gap. I think it's the most plausible thing that you have to solve for biblically. And so if you don't take the gap theory, you're stuck with when did Satan fall? Because apparently in verse 1, he's already fallen. So what do you do with that, right? So, okay. So here's the next one. The cause for the judgment was given as a rebellion of Satan or some pre-Adamic race that all sin. And I'm going to disagree with this second part of it. I don't think that necessarily has to be so. I'm going to posit the notion of, I think the earth, the original creation of the earth, which we'll take a look at, was there for the angels, or what call them heavenly beings, right? Because angel just means messenger, for the heavenly beings. And you see from the Garden of Eden standpoint that it was that real, if you want to say, thin veil between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. As Adam and Eve walked in perfection, they communed easily with our Savior in the garden, right? And Lucifer is able to be there amongst them, right? Or, Satan is able to be there among. So I don't think the construction of earth was the same as we see it now in a very four-dimensional, three physical and time. I think you have, let's say, a thin veil where Adam and Eve could interact with Lucifer, could interact with God, and yet they're in the garden. And so I think it's much more like that. And so I think you have not a pre-Adamic race, but you have an angelic race inhabiting the earth. And so I don't think there has to be, if Adam brought sin into the world, or the fall brought sin into the world, that doesn't hurt, my argument, because the pre-Adamic race, I think, was angelic and eternal. There was no death in that scenario. Okay, those who advocate for the gap theory do the following reasons. The Hebrew conjunction wa in Genesis 1:2. Gap theorists make part of their argument out of the Hebrew conjunction wa that begins in Genesis 1:2. They wish to translate it as but. The idea is that there's a contrast between what is stated in Genesis 1:1 and the statement of Genesis 1:2. The author is emphasizing that the earth was created perfect, but something happened and caused it to become formless and void. And I do like that there is some additional Hebraic, support for that. I don't think the argument I'm making in this video, that's not a sword I need to fall on. It's just supportive of the notion. The earth became void. the word translated in Genesis 1:2, the Hebrew verb haya, it is possible to translate had become, and thus the earth was created perfectly and then became without form and void. And if you do the word study there, again, that's not torturing the Hebrew. You'll see this in a bunch of people's creation studies, especially people that advocate for the gap theory, because the earth was without form and void, and the Hebrew word behind the was a word that, some will say more correctly should have been translated, the earth became without form and void. And so there was something happened in terms of it causing it to be in that desolate, without form and void state. Okay, and they talk about how that word gets translated when they come into the Septuagint, and he's making that argument there. Formless and void, Hebrew tohu wabohu or vabohu. So God created the world in a chaotic condition. The phrase without form and void seems to require some type of judgment. Then he says other passages, and I think this is important. Isaiah 34:11 and 4:23 are the only other instances of the phrase without form and void is used, clearly refers to some type of divine judgment. Hence Genesis 1:2 must also be a reference to judgment. Isaiah 34:11, but the cormorant, the bittern, shall possess it, the owl and the raven dwell in it. He shall stretch out upon a line of confusion the stones of emptiness. And then Jeremiah 4, go back and read these in context, please. Jeremiah 4, Jeremiah in context is saying, here comes Babylon in to destroy Jerusalem and Judah. And he's likening the devastation that's going to occur to some prior devastation. And it's this one. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. Same exact phrasing as Genesis 1:2. Tohu vabohu, right? And they had no light. And I beheld mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. And I beheld, and lo, there was no man. And all the birds of the heaven were fled, and I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. And so I do think he was using, if you read the whole context of Jeremiah 4, he was using the prior destruction that left the earth in tohu vabohu in Genesis 1:2. He's pointing to that, saying that's how bad the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be from the Babylonians. And so I think that's important to remember. I'm not sure if this article is going to hit it. Yes, we're going to get to the original, the creation account not being in vain. So that speaks of the other passages that talk about a judgment. In darkness, Genesis 1:2 speaks of the world in darkness. Darkness is used as a sign of sin and judgment. Okay, and he makes that point. Created and made, according to the gap theory, the original creation was in Genesis 1:1. No, and I'm disagreeing with that, and you'll see that in a minute. What happened on the 6 days of Genesis was not creating, but rather a makeover. Gap theorists make a distinction between the verb create, bara, and asa, and the verb bara is used in regard to God creating, while asa means refashioning or made to appear. The New Schofield Reference Bible makes the distinction. Only 3 creative acts of God are recorded: the heavens and the earth, animal life, human life. The first creative act refers to the dateless past. Neither here, Genesis 1:3, nor in verse 14 and 18, is an original creative act implied. A different word is used, the sense made to appear, made visible. The sun and moon were created in the beginning. The light came from the sun, of course, but the vapor diffused the light. Later the sun appeared in an unclouded sky. All right, and so you can see how gap theorists build through the Hebrew, to these points. And if what Dr. Michael Heiser says is that Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 is a condition that the earth, the existing earth and heavens were in when God said, "Let there be light," it implies that either one, God created the heavens and earth in vain, or that God partially created the heavens and earth, but it was in some sort of, in dark, formless and void state. And here we see in Isaiah 45, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it, he created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there's none else." And it's interesting what they're saying here, in particular in Isaiah 45, is he's focusing on the creation of the earth, and it wasn't that he established it and he didn't do it in vain. He didn't do it tohu vabohu. And so there's a big challenge to seeing Genesis 1:1 or 1:2 as being the initial creative act, but he just sort of partially did it. And then we have to get up to verse whatever that is, 6 or 7, where he says, and evening and morning was the first day. You would have to say that God gave us an account of a partial creation that was formless and void, and then the angel spirit had to finish the creation process. Whereas what I'm showing you here is God clearly said, "I didn't create the earth formless and void." It means he must have created it perfect, and then something happened to it to be in the condition that we see in verse 2 of Genesis 1. Hope you're with me to this point, because it's kind of a technical argument as we go, isn't it, saints? But I mean, a lot of the creation studies will either get technical on you scientifically, or they'll get technical on you, with language or whatever. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, even though it's a technical argument, look at we're corralling all the verses, and we're going to see more that speak toward the creation. And now you have to have an argument that can thread all of them in a very reasonable way. And I think this is the only reason why I believe in the gap theory. I'm not trying to solve science problems. I'm not trying to solve anything else. It just needs to solve for all of the verses that speak to it in the Bible. Okay. Isaiah 24:1 is often cited as a verse that speaks of the earth being formerly in ruin. "Behold, the Lord says, the earth waste devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters all of its inhabitants." Okay, so be aware of that verse. Then Jeremiah again, gap theorists also point to a passage in Jeremiah to bolster their point of the view. The prophet wrote, "I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void." I think we hit this again, because there's the comparison to the coming Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem. And the Schofield notes say that that's the condition of the earth as a result of judgment. Okay. And then Ezekiel 28 here, as describing the original creation before the desolation. The passage speaks of Satan dwelling in Eden, the garden of God, before sin infected it. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. And, you guys know the rest of this verse. This is the point I was trying to make. He's talking about this perfect garden of God, and Satan was in it before the fall, and he had all these benefits. Every stone was his covering, the sardius, the topaz. He was made beautiful, right, until sin was found within him, till the day iniquity was found in you. And so it's showing you that he was in the garden of God. Now, is that some ethereal, heavenly notion? Because the garden of God was also what Adam and Eve walked up and down in. That's why I believe that before Adam and Eve came, that notion of the earth existed, and yet this veil that we see between, the physical 3 dimensions here and what we know of heaven to be invisible, I don't think it was invisible back then. I think, when you were, quote, on earth, I think you had full view of the heavenly realm, that dimension. And you'll see other people advocating for that. Chuck Missler, I know, I was just watching some of his studies. He talks about not 4 dimensions, but he goes from the science standpoint. We know there's at least 10 dimensions. So how hard is it to think that heaven just exists in a dimension that we can't currently access? So there's another important description of the condition of earth. Before Satan fell, you had a condition of earth, and Satan was blessed in every possible way, and he was established there, okay? And then you have the angelic fall. The angels needed time to fall before Genesis 1. Okay, I agree with that. Since Adam and Eve did not conceive any children before the fall, there must have been a relatively short time after their conception, after God created them in the 6 days of Genesis. That doesn't allow adequate time for the rebellion, the judgment, expulsion. That's just an argument from logic, right? That's not really a passage argument, but it's interesting. And then some advocate that Hebrews 4:3 should be translated, the works were finished from the downfall of the world. The downfall, it's argued, refers to the catastrophe of Genesis 1:2. So what's Hebrews 4:3 say? For we which believe do enter into rest, as he said, as I've sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. And then Gapter cite Genesis 1:27, King James's proof, the earth was formerly filled with people, and God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and everything. You can only replenish something that was already filled. And so, is that an English word choice there that just happens to support this notion? I don't think so. I think, words are important. And so I think that is a notion where, why wouldn't God just say, go take dominion of the of the earth and subdue it? He said, go replenish it. And so I think that's a good argument. I don't believe in this pre-Adamic people because, again, it's an argument for science. I don't care how that went down. I'm worried about the Bible. The principle of the gap between statements. And so this is, I think, decent here. Why could there be long spans of time between Genesis, the first 3 verses, let's say, of Genesis, and all the rest, evening and morning were the first day and that type of thing? How could there be a long gap of time? It's only 3 verses. There's plenty of places in the Bible where you have that. Isaiah 61:1-2. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim the liberty to the captives, and the opening of prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, and a day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn. And when Jesus quoted that at the very beginning of his ministry, he left off the day of vengeance of our God. He broke a verse in the middle of the verse, and it just so happens that there's at least 2,000 years between all of this, which became true, and the very last thing. And so, yes, huge gaps can be even within a verse. You just have to be careful. Okay. And now here this guy goes. He's going to take a whack at creation, at gap theory, which I'm fine with. This is good to have a challenge here. There's no mention of creation anywhere else in the Bible. I say that's wrong. We're going to look at Job 38. The whole chapter is the creation account. not the historical view. Furthermore, the historical view of the Jewish, Roman Catholic, Protestant interpreters is that Genesis is an account of God's original creation. I disagree with that too. We're going to see a little quote at the end of my study where theologian from Southern Baptist University, okay, conservative, is going to say that the original verses in Genesis aren't a creation ex nihilo, which means from nothing, that they're a creation from existing material, the earth being existing in a state of formless and void. So I think that's going to be easy to defend against, okay? Genesis 1 is written as a straightforward account of God's creation, not some cryptic record. Well, again, I think if you actually want to be honest about it, and you go back to Michael Heiser's argument, our English translation of the Masoretic Hebrew isn't even a very good one, because the English translation is written as a very straightforward account. First, God created heavens and the earth, then the earth's in this state of formless and void, and then God said, let there be light, and everybody reads it like it's cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching right in a row. And yet, as Dr. Michael Heiser points out, those first two verses are the condition of the earth when the first act, the opening act of that recreation starts in verse 3. So, you know, you do want to look for clarity, but you also have to make sure you have a good translation of what's actually there. And Job 38 to me is a much more clear, straightforward account of the original creation than Genesis 1 is. Genesis 1 is a great account of what God prepped to fill the earth with humans. I don't believe that's our creation account in terms of the material that created the earth and the heavens and all that. And so I disagree. No earlier creation taught anywhere. There's no verse of scripture that teaches there was an earlier creation. If there were earlier creation, there should be at least one verse. Well, we'll look at what I think is, you know, a good chunk of a whole chapter. So I just don't agree. Contrary to scripture, there's no explicit verse about our previous creation. Same point. As mentioned in Genesis 2 and 3, creation of the heavens was what completed in 6 days was not just the work of God upon the earth, but the heaven. We're going to deal with Exodus 20. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that are in them, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hallowed it. I believe in a literal 6 days once the creation account starts. And so this is just an argument without understanding. No direct statement of judgment, and you guys saw there was plenty of direct statements of judgment in Jeremiah 4 and Isaiah and whatever. It's just he doesn't like the fact that people apply those direct statements of judgment to what he believes is the initial creation account in Genesis 1. So you see, no death before sin. Therefore, just as through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men. And I'm going to say that if what originally inhabited that pre-Adamic earth wasn't men, but the heavenly realm, I don't think we have a problem here. Because yes, through one man, death came. I agree, death to humans came because of the fall, not a problem. God made the world very good. Yeah, I think he saw it and behold, it was very good. Everything very good does not conflict with a recreation of the earth. And then he comes back to this Adam's sin and death. Darkness not necessarily evil. You know, when he says, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So he's trying to say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean, okay. And he says you can read that conjunction wa as something else. It's usually translated as a simple conjunction. Gap theorists attempt to make it a word that indicates a strong contrast previously stated. So two different ways to interpret that wa. But again, my argument doesn't, you don't fall on the sword because of that being correct or not. And then he goes after the Septuagint. And now he takes a look at unformed and unfilled. Tohu wabohu, translated without form and void, does not necessarily presume the type of judgment as the gap theory supposes. Well, of course, right? But it's interesting how all of the uses of tohu wabohu appear to show judgment of, let's just say, a very early creation of the earth. I mean, you're sitting there in Jeremiah 4 at 500 something BC, and he's comparing the coming judgment of the Babylonians to something that happened in the past. And you get to Genesis 1:1, and the earth is without form and void, sitting there, at that quote creation account. And then you got the Isaiah 45, tohu vabohu, God did not create it that way. So it's an argument, but it's not an argument that's, it's definitely not a kill shot to the gap theory. He's trying to just pile up a bunch of things, okay? And so there's no context to judgment of the creation account. And again, that's just where do you put those verses? He's saying that doesn't make for the details of Isaiah and Jeremiah is used to make judgment clear. The context of Genesis is not one of judgment. It is proper to read the circumstances of judgment in Isaiah and Jeremiah back into Genesis, where no judgment is required or even hinted at. And again, I think that's just he's not arguing that you can't read those verses that way. He's just saying it, in his mind, it doesn't fit there in Genesis 1. So here he says, it doesn't have to do with the original creation, whatever. So you guys get the flavor of it. Come read the whole thing. You can see that he's pushing against. Why would God create light again? Well, actually, God lifted the veil on the waters that were around the earth, right? And let there be light, that type of thing. So, blah blah blah. He goes after the different arguments. Come read the article. I definitely don't want to discount that. This guy has definitely poured himself into the argument, and I love seeing that. So let me just conclude then. You saw their argument for gap theory. You saw a bunch of arguments against. Go read the article. You saw Dr. Michael Heiser say the best reading of the Hebrew, given he's got his PhD in Hebrew language, I guess you would know that those first two verses in Genesis are conditions that existed when verse 3, God said, let there be light. And so I really think that challenges people seeing Genesis 1:1 as the original ex nihilo creation, from nothing creation. You just can't get there with a good reading of the Hebrew. And that, so I'm taking Dr. Michael Heiser's view of it. And what did he do? He defended his argument by looking at Encyclopedia Hebraica, right? The Jewish interpretation of the Torah text, and they say those are dependent verses. That was a condition the earth was in when let there be light was spoken. Those weren't verses saying, and here's how from nothing God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so I think those are real powerful statements against some of the rest of the points there that were being made in that article. So my personal take currently is not aligned with that article's view of the gap theory. And this is my note to my church buddies that I had dinner with last night. I think God gave the original creation of the earth to angels who, like in the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus and those other two angels, talking to Abraham in Genesis 18 before Sodom and Gomorrah happened, right? And then talking with Joshua, remember, the pre-incarnate Jesus shows up and Joshua says, "Are you with us or against us?" And Jesus is there in his flaming sword and all that and says, "Take off your shoes, Joshua, you're on holy ground." So you see angels, or in this case Jesus, they don't have a problem even currently post-fall with being able to manifest in human likeness, right? So I think that shows us now, I do think the veil between our dimension and the heavenly realm was intentional, because later you get to Jude, and maybe we'll take a look at that. Jude says that the angels that left their first estate, pointing to Genesis 6, it cohabited with the women, right? Well, I think, post the recreation, let's say in Genesis 1, the separation or the veil, post the fall, the veil became dark between the dimensions, that we see and what's really there if you included the heavenly realm. Here in Jude, and the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the day of judgment. So you can see there's, a compartment or a place that the angelic realm was supposed to hold to, and they didn't. They manifested back on earth. And then you see in Hebrews 13:2, it says, "Let brotherly love continue, because you may have entertained angels unaware." And again, speaking to the fact that angels can very comfortably move around among us in very human physical like form. So the notion of the earth, be given to angels first, would they fit in this realm? I think, there's backing to that. We're going to look at Job 38 here in a minute, because I think that helps us when we take a look at this even more. But there's also some physical evidence that may exist that even points to this notion of the earth was the habitation of the angelic realm before, at least before the flood, and I'd argue before creation. And you'll see why I say that in a minute. Here, if you go to the Samaritan Kings list, and it's a stele, a little pillar. Let me see if I can bring that up without clobbering everything. Here it is. This was found in Sumer, ancient southern Iraq, right? And it was trying to list all the kings from, times past up until current, and Sumer, is of course the region of Babylon and the original, if you say Tower of Babel and all of that, up until that second, what they call the new Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. And so you've got this king's list, and they have verified some of the earliest rulers that they can do archaeologically is Imbragargasi of Kish, 2600 BC. And yet, even with that, you've got this crazy thing that happened before you get to Kish. So here's that Kish guy they just referenced, that they did find other archaeological evidence to him. What's before that? The flood. Interesting. What's before that? Here's a king that reigned for 28,800 years. Here's a king that reigned for 18,600 years. Here's a king that reigned for 21,000 years, right? 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Yeah, obviously that can't be true. That's got to be mythological, right? Just like Zeus is mythological. in the Greek God scenario. Well, what if this? What if, the earth was originally given to the quote angelic realm, heavenly beings that were eternal, and they were rulers over the earth, and yet they sinned just like we were given our chance to make free decisions, and the angels, Satan, led them into their fall, and some not, of course, right? Could this then be more plausible that these are eternal beings and these reigning kings? These reigning kings were not put to death necessarily, but they lost their throne. Zimber fell, the kingship was taken to Zupog. Larg fell, the kingship was taken to Zimbri, right? But if you go into this, they talk about the great deluge, and they talk about the flood that swept over, and then there was this history before it. And I guess the point I would make is scholars will date history, and it's very helpful because they assume that this King's List is fairly accurate. And you can even see here where they start putting in other biblical references or other archaeological references to the King's List that they had figured out. We found this, we found this, we found this, right? So I don't know what to do with this, but I think it's interesting that somebody attempted to go back. And how would somebody go back on this stele and come up with specific names of specific kings and theoretically reigns that they had? Who existed post the flood that could tell you who were kings, prior to the flood? Well, I think you've got just a few candidates. You've got Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Unless there was some document left over pre-flood, or unless all of this is completely bogus, made up. So I'm leaving you with that as possible archaeological evidence of something pre-flood where nearly eternal beings, let's say, were enumerated as kings of the earth. All right, so I hope that one's interesting. Let me just come back here. Oh, and in that article, if you go read it, that's just Wikipedia, right? Part of the other argument they make was that these early rulers were descended from gods or the godly realm. Again, if that was angels physically manifesting, or if the veil between the heavenly realm and earth was thin, that could make a lot of sense. Okay. The next point is, the article says there's no other creation account if Genesis 1 is a recreation account. Well, this is where I got the problem, because Job 38 is actually where in detail we see God himself saying, here's how I created the earth, right? So if Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, according to the best Hebrew interpretation, Encyclopedia Hebraica, and the Hebrew PhD scholar Michael Heiser saying those are preconditions to Genesis 1:3, then I think you got to go looking for that original creation of the earth to know what the original creation was. And that to me is Job 38. Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up thy loins now, like a man frail. Demand of thee, and answer thou me. Okay, I'll get us into English here. And I'm sensitive to the King James Version and the received text, or the Textus Receptus, being the standard to go by. I'm just reading you some verses here, and it's easier to read out of a more modern English translation, Saints. So you King James only folks, there's nothing in this set of statements here that I don't think would be violated if I just read it in King James or the ISV. So, okay. Stand up like a man. I'll ask you some questions and you give me some answers. This is God speaking. Where were you when I laid the foundation of my earth? Well, there you go. This is the original creation account. Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, the earth existed in that tohu vabohu condition, that formless and void condition, before God said, let there be light. So when was it actually created? It's right here. When were you when I laid the foundations of my earth? Tell me, since you're so informed. Who sets its measurements? Am I to assume you know? Who stretched out the boundary line over it? See, original creation. On what were the basis set? Who laid the cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the divine beings shouted joyfully. Now I'm going to make a point on this, but you can tell me if you think I'm stretching a little bit. But let's think about this. The morning stars, and if you go back into this, they're also going to be called sons of God down below. Benai Elohim, I think it is. But this is the angelic realm, the morning stars sang together, and all the divine beings shouted for joy. Well, now think about this. God's creating the physical earth the first time. The angelic realm is watching. Why would that excite them? Why are they joyfully shouting if they didn't have some part in what was going to happen with that creation, right? I mean, I think there's just a little logical statement there that God is showing us that the original creation of the earth was a huge delight to the angelic realm. And so I think it's because he's about to give them something, is my argument. He's about to give them this creation to participate in. Who enclosed the sea with its limits when it gushed forth out of the womb? And that's interesting. That could be talking about the way the waters of the earth originally happened. Maybe he's jumped forward in time here, talking about when the flood came, right? It wasn't just rain. You go read the passage. Water came up out of the earth and flooded the earth. When I made the clouds to be its clouds and thick darkness and swaddling blanket, when I prescribed a boundary for it, set a place, the bars. So this is the original creation of the earth, would be my argument. So in that article saying, well, there's no other creation account talking about the creation of the heavens and the earth, I'd say you missed a whole chapter here, okay? And I think this is the compelling one for me, that the morning stars sang together when the earth was created. I think it's pointing to they're about to inherit this new creation that God was going to make. That would be my argument for the shouting and joy when the earth was created. Okay, and then the last one that I think is really, hard set of verses for the gap theory, but I think there's a great answer for it, is looking at this Exodus 20:11. Let's go pop that up. Now this in context is the Ten Commandments, and God is commissioning the Sabbath. So here, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. For 6 days you labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You are not to do any work, neither you nor your son nor your daughters, nor male or female servant, nor livestock, nor the alien who is within your gates, because the Lord made the heavens and earth and the sea and all that's in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So, in my mind, he's saying, okay, I made the heavens, the earth, and all that's in it and whatever. And it's 6 literal days. So now, he's pointing you directly back, isn't he, to Genesis 1 account. How then can you claim that there was any time before Genesis 1:1 if this is the way that the Lord is doing it? In 6 literal days, right? He's defending 6 literal days. Okay, and so I had to flip over now to show you something. So for in 6 days the Lord made, I'm going to click on that, a saw, primitive root to make, in the broadest sense, catch this, the widest application, right? To bear, bestow, to bring forth. So you can see there, and I'm not going to try and drill into all the possible permutations, but it's a very broad use of create, fashion, made. Let's go take a look then of how else it's used, and I think it's interesting, especially in Genesis 1. And God made, same word, the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. Now, he made what? The firmament. Let's take a look at the verse right before it. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So firmament, in this case, was made from a division of something that existed, waters. It wasn't created out of nothing. Let's take a look at the next one. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, herb, yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding, and here's our word again, creating fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself. Well, that one's self-explanatory. The fruit wasn't created ex nihilo, wasn't created from nothing. It was created from the seed, right? And so when he brought forth these other things and they yielded seed, he's not using that same word, but he's using yielding, fashioning fruit from the seed, right? And so the and you can go look at the rest of them, but right in Genesis, 1, we have the creation account of God making things, right? And he's doing it from something that existed. And so even Exodus 20:11, when he says, and God made the earth as he did like the Sabbath in 6 literal days, that very well could be supported that he made the earth or recreated the earth from an existing earth, which Genesis verse 1 and 2 also presume. So I think Exodus 20:11 is speaking to 6 literal days of recreation from an existing earth, and through the word study of that English word made, or the Hebrew word that was in there, asah, that all fits nicely with the correct Hebrew interpretation of verse 1 and verse 2. Okay, a little bit more on this one. We have another little creation recount from Peter, 2 Peter 3:5. Bring this up here. But they deliberately ignore the fact that long ago the heavens existed and the earth was formed by God's word out of water and with water. And so see, he is going back to the creation or the recreation of something that was not from ex nihilo, wasn't created out of nothing. He's pointing to those waters that existed, and the earth was formed and not created out of Genesis 1 would be my argument there. And so again, it looks like that notion of Genesis 1, 1 and 1, 2 is a condition the existing earth was in before the quote creation days began. And I just want to make sure, because I know people say, the creation account, Genesis 1, if you don't say it's ex nihilo, you're a heretic, you're whatever. I did research into that, before I started representing this, and you can find this in Wikipedia, right? So it's out in the public domain. Bruce K. Waltke wrote an extensive biblical study of creation theology in which he argues for creation from chaos, that tohu vabohu, rather than from nothing, based on the Hebrew Torah and the New Testament text. So we just looked at that, New Testament and the Hebrew Torah. The Western Conservative Baptist Seminary published his work in 74 and again in 81. On a historical basis, many scholars agree that the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo was not an original intent of the biblical authors, but instead a change in the interpretation of the text that began to evolve in the mid-2nd century AD in the atmosphere of Hellenistic philosophy. The idea solidified around 200 AD in arguments and in response to the Gnostics, the Stoics, and the Platonists. And so I guess for all those that get hung up on that ex nihilo concept having to be there in Genesis 1, or you're preaching, outright heresy, I would say, here you have a conservative Baptist publication that is saying the correct interpretation of both the Old Testament and the New Testament verses is not a creation out of nothing in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. So I hope, saints, that I know this was a longer study. I hope that pins down, though, a whole bunch of arguments on the creation account and clears up maybe what options are left. If you're still a young earth creationist or an old earth creationist, it doesn't really matter to me. You have to take all of the passages that speak of creation, and you have to have some sort of story that threads them all. You can't just say, well, I ascribe to a young earth creation account without knowing why and what the verses are that support it. So God bless you, saints.